It's Dr. T, and this episode we're answering the question, why is the U.S. such a divided country? We do have multiple divisions here in the United States along racial and ethnic lines, along economic lines, cultural lines, religious lines, political lines, and we're going to unpack a little bit for each of those. So why so much division? Well, we are a very diverse society. We are a nation primarily of immigrants. So people have come from all over the world, bringing their languages, their cultural traditions, their religious practices to the United States, to what we've historically called the melting pot. We're really more like a chunky stew. We haven't really amalgamated everybody into one thing. We all maintain distinctive features of our lives. And we have historically celebrated the freedom to be who we are. So that is part of our cultural heritage. So racial division. This is baked into our country. We have a centuries-long history of using labor of enslaved people to enrich, in this case, whites who were plantation owners, factory owners, etc. And so they used this labor because it was the cheapest form of labor they could come up with, and used it to make a profit. Layered on top of that is an equally long history of white supremacy. Laws and policies and social and cultural practices put into place to advantage or privilege whites and to separate, segregate, and to depress the interests of Blacks in particular in this country. We have a long history of discrimination in housing at local, state, and federal level, in practices, in lending, in laws about who can access federal dollars and so forth. And that has led to persistent segregation in housing and in education, because education is rooted in where you live, in jobs. All of those things continue to exist today, that kind of discrimination. It's not just part of our history, it is part of our current lived experience. We also have economic divisions that have long existed. We've always had rich, poor, people in the middle, the working and middle classes. Over the last 50 years, the gap between the rich and the rest of our society has increased dramatically. We talked about how even as worker productivity has gone up, wages have not. We've had people become billionaires. And so we have this tremendous gap in access to economic resources. And people who are in the middle, or maybe even in the working poor class, feel like something's wrong. The American dream says if you work hard and if you play by the rules, you get ahead and you can live a good, comfortable life. That's what meritocracy is all about, right? My brains, my determination, my hard work, and I can get ahead. If people are doing those things and they're not able to get ahead, they look for someone to blame. Because meritocracy says if I don't get ahead, it's my fault. And I'm unwilling to blame myself and say I'm lazy or not motivated enough or I'm too stupid to get ahead in this game. So I have to blame someone else. So that's where the economic divisions are really stoked. We've also seen some very significant cultural divisions. I'm just going to touch on a couple of them that most people will recognize right away. Abortion has been a very strong point of cultural division in this country. The Supreme Court Roe v. Wade decision in 1973 meant that women were allowed access to abortions nationwide. Now, a lot of states have done a lot to restrict them, and the Supreme Court over the years, as it shifted to a more conservative viewpoint, has upheld those, but it still was the law of land until June of 2022, when the Supreme Court overturned itself and wiped away that constitutional protection. And so now lots of things have happened in states, very, very restrictive policies, essentially shutting down abortion, laws to try to criminalize even miscarriages, a lot of things going on this right now. But it has been a divisive issue in our country. Another very divisive cultural issue has surrounded the LGBTQ plus communities. So same-sex marriage, which was made legal by the Supreme Court in the recent decade, is now potentially under attack. There's some concern that that might be revisited. There is a lot of turmoil around recognizing transgender individuals, people who identify as non-binary, meaning that they don't see themselves as boy or girl or man or woman. Gender is a more fluid concept to them. All of these are changes that for some people from a particular religious perspective are unacceptable in our society. And so there's a lot of pushback against these sorts of things. Despite these strong religious traditions and the pushback, we actually are moving away from religion as being a dominant force in our culture. So in most recent polling, about 30% of Americans say they aren't attached to any particular religious tradition. So that's almost a third. That's a pretty big number. Only 30%, again, a third, just slightly under a third, actually attend religious services on a regular basis. These cultural wars, if you will, people have labeled them the culture wars, are driven by those with particular religious views, usually the Christian right, evangelicals. But we're also seeing something new, and that is the rise of white Christian nationalism with Trump and his regime. And so there's much more pushback in these areas. These culture wars are not dissipating, even though as a country we're becoming a little bit less religious over time. There is this strong counter push for white Christian nationalism that is making these cultural features much more prominent, and they're going to be more hotly contested in the coming years. So why all this division? Well, many people see our social life as a zero-sum situation. Abortion. You either get one or you don't. Life begins at conception or it doesn't. Like there's a sort of a black and white as opposed to shades of gray. Expanding civil rights. There's this Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote that I absolutely love, that it says, equal rights for others does not mean fewer rights for you. It's not pie. And that's what zero sum is. If you get a bigger slice, I get less. That's not it. Expanding rights just means we recognize the humanity and the freedom of choice that all people have. Your right to vote doesn't interfere with my right to vote. Your right to exist doesn't interfere with my right to exist. But people are afraid of change. They're particularly afraid that they're going to lose something. And so politicians, particularly on the right, Republicans, have exploited people's fear of change, their fear of losing something, to get them to turn against their economic interests. So they're exploiting cultural differences like support for same-sex marriage, support for transgender rights, because it keeps people's attention off this huge income gap that we see and wealth gap between the rich, the most rich, the very richest of the rich, and all the rest of us, right? A few hundred people and all the rest of us in this country of over 330 million people. There's going to be more to come on this, so stay tuned.